So this class is designed to be a beginning class, but it's actually many people who have studied Buddhism for a long time have actually found that it's very helpful, because essentially we give you the big picture in Buddhism. So essentially we give you the broad look, so you see all of Buddhism sort of in one combined picture. So that, which makes many people find makes it easy to understand. Because for many people, when they come to Buddhism, what happens to them is they start from one little specific course or one teaching, and they get sort of a piecemeal approach to Buddhism. And they often never see the big picture. And so it's often very confusing to them. And so the goal of this class is to give you that big picture. So we're going to do all of Buddhism in 4 sessions. So this is the first of 4 sessions. And today is sort of what I'm mainly going to focus on is sort of like the introduction. So this is an introduction to Buddhism, but today it's going to be sort of the introduction to the introduction. So I'm going to talk about, let's see, just set up a little bit. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, what the goal of this class is. I'm going to add a few more details to what I've said. I'm going to talk about who a Buddhist is, what Buddhism is, how Buddhism is a different way of thinking about the world. And in particular, I think what's really important is what's really the bottom line is why people should practice Buddhism. What do you benefit from that, especially if you're doing it correctly? And how do you do it correctly? So, and then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the important aspects of the life of Buddha, who he was when he lived, what his main goal in life was. We're going to talk about the history of Buddhism, how Buddhism spread throughout the world, and what are all the different types of Buddhism that you can find. So this is sort of the intro part to the larger picture. And then after that, in the succeeding classes, we're actually going to get into the main doctrines of Buddhism. So in particular, we're going to talk about the 4 Noble Truths, which I would say is the core Buddhist teaching. And everything can sort of spring from there. But then after that, then we'll get more into the details. So we'll actually go through the main practices that are pretty much common to all Buddhism. I mean, the thing that's tricky about Buddhism is that it's spread to many different cultures. And because of that, it got many different cultural overlays. And so it often seems like it's wildly different from one type of Buddhism to another, say from Zen to Tibetan Buddhism to the Theravadan Buddha of Southeast Asia, for example. They all seem on the surface to look very different, but actually there's a common core which makes them, which they all share. And so that's the part that I want to focus on. Although, since our center is a Tibetan Buddhist center, the perspective I have will be from that perspective. But I try to be as fair as possible to all of the different traditions. And I actually read in other traditions and study aspects of other traditions, which I find actually very helpful. So first of all, let me just ask if there's any questions at this point.
No, I don't have any questions as yet.
Okay, yeah. So that's also the part of that's important for this course, is you should feel free to just butt in and ask questions as we go along, especially since there's just the 2 of us, because the goal of it is really to help you. So I'm trying to say the things that I think will help you the most, but I may be missing out, and I may be missing the things that you think are important. So anyway, as far as I'm concerned, the course is really for you, and I'm just trying to do the best I can to provide you with what I hope is helpful. Okay, so again, as I said before, this class is actually designed for complete beginners, for people who've just barely heard of Buddhism and really don't know what it is. You, of course, have attended many classes, so I will try to adapt it more for you. But as I said, even experienced people find this really helpful. And what's really helpful too, I think, is also just knowing the terminology of Buddhism. Things like renunciation, bodhicitta. There's a whole set of special terms in nirvana and all of these things. And I think it's very helpful for people just to have a very simple understanding of what all these terms mean. So then when you go into a class, you feel like you can follow it. Okay, so now the beginning part is talking about who is a Buddhist. I don't know if you've ever heard people talk about that in general before or not. But basically, there are different definitions that are given. But the standard definition that I think which actually goes back to the Buddha himself, which I'll talk later how we know what the Buddha said from the Buddhist Sutras. But basically, the definition of who a Buddhist is has always been said, going for refuge to the three jewels. And the three jewels are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so Buddha, of course, is the person who originated all of these teachings. Dharma is his teachings. And Sangha are all of us who are following the Buddhist teachings. And so when we talk about going for refuge, what we really mean is basically feeling confident that Buddhism will help us. And for that reason, trying to at least put the teachings into practice and see how they work. So it's very different than Western notions of religion. You know, in the West, there's often a creed that you have to belong to. You have to either, believe in God in special ways and all these very special things. But Eastern religions tend to be more about practice rather than belief. So in Buddhism, you don't actually have to really believe anything. But the Buddha did talk about having faith in Buddhism. But what he really meant by faith was just, again, confidence that these teachings can help you. And so again, there's a lot of things that for Westerners can be very difficult, like reincarnation, especially I think is very difficult for people. But there's also various other things about the cosmology that sometimes people find is difficult. And I would say is, if you find something difficult, don't worry about it. It's sort of, Buddhism is not about belief. It's about finding a way of practicing. And again, I'll slowly get more into that as we go along. And in fact, the one thing that Buddha said, and he said this very clearly, he says, you shouldn't believe anything I say just because I'm the Buddha, this deeply religious person, but rather you always have to test things for yourself. And so that's the thing that I've always found refreshing and open about Buddhism, that it's, all of these things that we talk about, you really have to look into your own life and see for yourself whether you find that they're true or not. And you don't have to follow everything in the Buddhist path. Some people just pick out particular things. Some people focus on meditation, for example, and other people focus on mindfulness, which is another big Buddhist teachings. And it's perfectly fine to just do, if you like, sort of follow a partial Buddhist path. You don't have to follow the whole thing. And I think what happens to most people is they start slowly, and then they get into it more and more, and they build on their practice. So there are specific things that the Buddha did teach, and we're going to talk about that. He did teach about enlightenment, nirvana, and many such things. But again, I don't think the emphasis isn't on believing specific doctrines. I think the emphasis is on really making your life better. And that's one of the things that I want to particularly focus on in this course in particular. So what is Buddhism? Well, Buddhism to different people mean different things. So for many people, they think that Buddhism is a religion. And there are, in certain types of Buddhism, very heavy religious ceremony. And it's very, very much like a traditional religion. Like if you went into a Catholic church and you had censers with incense and a big altar and stuff. So Buddhism, in some of its manifestations, can manifest in a very religious format. And of all the different types of Buddhism, I would say in particular, Tibetan Buddhism is the most religious of all. It has the most ceremony, symbolism, and so forth. But on the other hand, some people see Buddhism as just as a philosophy, a way of life. And in the original form that Buddha taught when he was alive, he didn't really have religious aspects very much. He focused mainly on meditation and seeing the world as it really is, which is a huge motif in what we're going to continue to talk about. And if you go to certain forms of Buddhism, like Zen Buddhism, it's very austere, very little religious ceremony, actually very beautiful architecture and so forth. But it's not very, it doesn't have all of the, all the pictures of Buddhism on the wall and all the same things that you would find in a Tibetan center. So it's very different. And for that reason, some people think of Buddhism as actually just a philosophy of life. And that's sort of more in the vein that the way that philosophers at the time of Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greeks, for them, the Epicureans and Cynics and so forth, many of these people looked at Buddha as philosophy as actually a way of life, a way of living that makes your life better. And you can also take Buddhism in that way. You can skip all of the ceremony and just focus on the aspects that, just make your life better. For me and personally, I mean, you can ask why do I in particular practice Buddhism? And I would say that the reason I practice Buddhism is because for me, it's the only sane way of living I've ever found. It makes my life sane and happy and gives me a path that really makes me feel good about my life. And it does that on a day-to-day level. And so for me, that's what I find the deepest aspect of Buddhism. And I sort of want to actually emphasize that, because if it isn't a path that makes your life better from moment to moment, if there's just some big goal at the end of it, like enlightenment, I feel like you're sort of missing a big part of it. When Buddha was alive, he in particular said over and over again that Dharma is good in the beginning, it's good in the middle, and it's good at the end. And what he meant by that is that these teachings help people who are even at the beginning of their class, at the beginning of their study of Buddhism, people who are just barely starting to begin the Buddhist path, find the teachings very helpful in just their ordinary lives. It's good in the middle because people who are experienced Buddhists continue to have that benefit. And it's good in the end because those benefits continue all the way even to enlightenment. And I'm going to talk more about specific benefits as we go along. But let me just stop here and ask if there's any questions, because I'm sort of talking very broadly and maybe too broadly.
No, I'm good so far. Thank you.
Okay. So, again, I think, as I say, for people in the West, I mean, we're in an unusual situation. For most countries that Buddhism spread to, it became often one of either the dominant religion or one of a few dominant religions, and people grew up with Buddhism in the same way. For me, I grew up as a Catholic from my family. And when you grow up in a religion, everything's familiar and you just sort of follow along with it. But in the West, we haven't had that sort of tradition of Buddhism the way that they have in the East. So for many of us, what we see when we approach Buddhism is we see all of these different Buddhist centers. And each of these different Buddhist centers represent a different type of Buddhism. In Santa Fe, I'm not sure where are you coming? Is it Aphisha? I'm not sure how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, I'm currently in Bali, Indonesia.
Wow, you're in Indonesia. Okay. So, well, that's helpful because then you're familiar with the Eastern way of looking at things. far more. But in Santa Fe, for example, there are 4 Tibetan lineages, and we have 4 different Tibetan Buddhist centers, each representing each of the 4 Tibetan lineages. We have a Zen Buddhist center. We have a Theravadan center. So we have all of these different forms of Buddhism available to us. And so for us, most of this, it's sort of a random process, which one we hit first. And because of that, it's, the Buddhism that you reach seems very, very different for each person. Where you are, Afisha, what kind of Buddhism is natural from around where you are?
I'm American. I'm just here.
Oh, okay.
Because of COVID, I'm just traveling.
Okay, so you are okay. So you're not permanently living in Indonesia.
No.
Okay. So you're in the same perspective I am. It's hard to know. It's amazing how with the Zoom people come from all over the place, and it's hard to know. So anyway, if you go into a Zen center, I mean, they have a world famous Zen center here in Santa Fe that people come to from all over the world, at least pre-COVID when they could travel. And, so each of these centers looks very different, but at the heart, they are the same. The other thing that, so it can be very confusing to people because of these cultural overlays. And I can explain why there are all those cultural overlays also. And the other thing too is, of course, the language is very different. So most of the Buddhism comes from these Oriental languages, either Pali or Sanskrit. Pali is sort of a variant of Sanskrit, or even Chinese or Japanese or whatever. And so the terminology for that reason can be very confusing. However, since Buddha started in India, the Sanskrit terminology is pretty common to all the different traditions. So that's what I will focus on. I don't know any Japanese or Korean or Chinese. Okay. So, but the one thing that is important, and part of the reason why there are these cultural overlays actually comes from the Buddha himself. Because when the Buddha was alive, he emphasized speaking to the ordinary people in their ordinary language. So we'll find out more about the Buddha, but the Buddha came from a very high level of Indian society. And of course, he knew the intellectual language. The main intellectual language of India is Sanskrit. And I'm sure he must have known Sanskrit, but he refused to speak in this intellectual language. He always would speak in the local dialects of where he lived in sort of northern India. And he emphasized that. And in fact, later on, when many of his disciples wandered back to their homelands or into other areas and would give Buddhist teachings, they asked the Buddha, should I keep speaking the same language that you've been speaking, so I represent your words exactly as you spoke them, or should I translate them into the local language? And the message that Buddha gave to them is always use the local language, because the emphasis was on helping people. And that is one of the main themes, again, in Buddhism, is always helping people. The Buddha always talked about skillful means. And what he meant by that is that whenever he gave teachings, he would always try to give teachings in a way that would help the people. So he would try to, with his mind, he could sort of sense what the people needed, and he would give the sort of teaching that he felt would be most helpful to them in a way that would also be, in a language and a manner that would also be most helpful to them. And so following that tradition along throughout all the different ways so now you can see why all the different cultural overlays came about, is because the Buddha always emphasized speaking to the people in their ordinary language and in their ordinary way. Okay, so the other thing too that I think is useful, especially for people in the West, is a lot of actually the Buddhism terminology is spread into the West. We talk about karma, nirvana, and mindfulness. And so the other thing that I want to do when I talk in this course is I want to be very careful to say how the Buddhists view these things. Because a lot of times the Western concepts have sort of slipped away from their original meaning. And because they have slipped away from their original meanings, sometimes they can give a distorted view of Buddhism. So I'm going to try to be very careful about talking about these different ideas and what they mean for Buddhists, as opposed to just common Western language. The other thing, too, that I think is important, and we're going to see this as we get deeper into the teachings, is in my mind, Buddhism is a radical worldview. It's a completely different way of looking at the world than the way that we look at the world in the West. The West is very materialistic and focused on things and money and success, and Buddhism is the exact opposite of that. And so I hope to convey that to you, that sense of what that difference is, so you sort of get that, because I think that if there's anything that comes from this course, I think it's getting that sense of the worldview of Buddhism, how the Buddhists actually look at the world. And to me, it's a very beautiful way of looking at the world. I mean, I'm always just blown away at how wonderful this worldview is. But we'll get into that as we get more into the teachings. So again, let me just stop here and just ask whether there's anything. I haven't really said that much more. Okay, so otherwise, I'm just going to continue. So now I think it's an important question at the beginning of a course on Buddhism. So this course is an overview of all of Buddhism. One thing to talk about, I think that's important at the beginning, is say, why would you even care about learning or practicing Buddhism? Because I think that's a legitimate question, because we're going to spend these 4 classes studying this. And so I think it's worthwhile to say what you might get out of it. And basically, what I would say is the core message actually goes back to Buddha himself. And we will get into that more when we talk about Buddha's life. But the main core teaching of Buddhism is how to be happy and how to avoid suffering. So if you were to say, what is Buddhism about in a nutshell, it's how to be happy and how to avoid suffering. And I would add to that, it's also, since life tends to inevitably bring some types of suffering into your lives, how do you manage the suffering when it does appear? How can you manage to be happy even when you're in difficult circumstances? And I would say that Buddhism has actually very beautiful answers to all of those questions. And to me, they actually make a lot of sense. It's a very rational, logical way of looking at the world that I find deeply enchanting. Part of that is, I think part of that also, the other sort of core theme that runs all throughout Buddhism is a notion of focusing on the mind. In Buddhism, Buddhism actually is all about our minds in one sense or another. It's always focusing on what's going on inside of our head. And, as we get deeper into that, you'll see why that matters so much. But it is in particular because Buddhism is about focusing on what's happening inside of our own minds, that it makes possible these aspects such as how you can deal with difficult situations. And part of that, for example, is to realize that external events in and of themselves actually have no specific emotional meaning. They're neither happy or sad, terrible, nor good. It's only when we filter them through our own mental outlook that they acquire all of these different emotional overtones. So, for example, if your car breaks down, usually you feel terrible about it because you start thinking about how expensive it is to fix it, what a hassle it is, that maybe you'll have to take it into a repair shop, maybe you'll have to live without a car for a few days. And as your mind just sort of filters around all of these things, you can make yourself more and more unhappy until you're, if you really let it circulate, you can almost be ready to scream. You can make yourself so unhappy. But you can see that the role that the mind plays in making you unhappy. In effect, the car breaking down is just the car breaking down. It's neither happy nor sad. It's just what it is. It's just an event. And it's how it affects us and how we look at it that sort of determines how we're affected by it. And so for that reason, you begin to see why mind is so hugely important. And so that's a motif that we're going to continue to look at as we go along. The other thing that Buddhism is about, and this goes back to Buddha himself. For Buddha himself, he was actually not interested that much in philosophy. He was interested in how you practically live your life, how you make yourself happy and avoid suffering. And when the Buddha taught when he was alive, he loved giving various analogies because people, and metaphors, because people found that a very helpful way for understanding his message. And one very interesting sort of bit of symbolism or metaphor or a little story that he used to explain what he was trying to do is he said, imagine that you're in a forest, and as you're walking along the forest, there's a hunter in the forest with a bow and arrow, and he shoots, maybe thinking you're a deer, and actually hits you with the arrow. And maybe that arrow is poisoned because maybe he's trying to kill the animal. And as you fall down and collapse, and your people around you try to help you, when that situation happens, you don't look at the arrow and say, oh, that's a beautiful arrow. I wonder what type of wood that was used. That looks like very strong wood. Oh, the feathers are just absolutely gorgeous. I wonder what kind of bird they came from. You don't think in those sorts of terms, which would be more of a philosophical way of looking at it. But the way you think is you think in a very practical way. Oh, I've got to pull this arrow out of my body. Maybe it has poison. Maybe I need to deal with, deal with the poison. Maybe I got to stop the wound from bleeding and so forth. Those are the things you focus on. And in the same way, the Buddha said that his goal was to actually help people stop their suffering. And so when you're helping people stop their suffering, he has to tell you in very practical terms how you can stop your suffering. Again, which has a lot to do with looking at how your mind looks at the world and changing how your mind looks at the world. So the Buddha himself sort of shied away from philosophy. Of course, since that time, there's been a huge buildup of Buddhist philosophy, and it's studied very intensely. A lot of that Buddhist philosophy came as the Buddhists were trying to defend themselves from Hindu points of view, and they were often attacked by Hindu philosophers. So sort of in self-defense, Buddhism built up a very elaborate Buddhist philosophy as well. But the original Buddha was not really focused on that. He was focused on practical things. And so I think that's very helpful to keep in mind that the Buddha, in fact, the Buddha always felt like views were, in a sense, not that helpful, because as we will see, a lot of people's views get distorted by a form of egotism. We're always thinking about what's good for me, what makes me happy, what makes me sad. And when we start thinking of that way, it often distorts the views that we have of the world, and we don't actually see the world accurately. And another big theme in Buddhism is that Buddha said it's very important to see the world as it really is, how it really functions. And because once you see the world as it really is and how it actually functions, that's what gives you the clue how to stop suffering. So anyway, we're going to come back and go more deeply into that. But maybe I should stop here. I mean, I'm giving you sort of tantalizing hints, but I'm not really explaining a lot of this, but we will get more into this now. So do either of you have any questions? Okay, so in that case, I will continue. So of course, another aspect of Buddhism is a huge aspect, is a lot of Buddhism is about compassion and caring for other people. And especially in the later forms of Buddhism, we're going to talk about Mahayana Buddhism, which is the dominant form of Buddhism today. In fact, this caring and compassion for people is the most dominant aspect of the Mahayana path in particular. But you can ask yourself, how can you come to this notion of the need for helping others and compassion? And the way the Buddha explained it is he said basically that all human beings, in one sense, are the same. You know, of course, we look differently, we have different backgrounds, different abilities in different areas. But the one thing that all humans share is these things I was talking about before, that all humans want to be happy and they want to avoid suffering. And once you start thinking about that way, then you realize that in a certain sense, there's an equality among all humans. In some sense, we're all the same. We all share the same trait. And in particular, if you analyze the world very carefully, there's no real reason why anybody should be above other people or other people should be inferior to other people. We're basically all the same. We all have the same common share of humanity. And so from that point of view, you know, I look at myself and I say, I want to be happy and I want to avoid suffering. But then I look at the other person next to me and I say, well, you want to be happy and you want to avoid suffering also. So why should I make you suffer so that I can be happy? So for example, if you have some valuable item in your possession, why should I steal it to make myself happy to have this wonderful possession while making you suffer? There's no good real reason for it. It just makes no sense at all on a logical level. So from that point of view, once we realize that all people are the same, then we realize that in the same way, I want other people to care and take care of me and not harm me. So I need to do the same for other people. And that's a common theme that runs through Buddhism also, this notion that we're all in the same boat and we need to all help each other. So there's an emphasis, sometimes the way they talk about this is that there's an emphasis on others. And so and in fact, the other reason for it, as we get deeper into it, is that Buddha talked about what we will talk about as delusions or afflictions. These are negative states of mind that make us unhappy, that make us actually suffer, that increase our suffering in the world. And these things, these sort of negative states of mind are things like, they're called either delusions or afflictions. The Sanskrit word is klesha, and sometimes it's translated one way or the other way, but it's the same way. These are distorted ways of looking at the world. And these are ways that actually increase our suffering. And typical examples of these things is greedy behavior, hatred, all of these things, which I think for most people, they would commonly talk about as negative states of mind. And we're going to talk more specifically about how these things specifically increase the suffering in our life. But at any rate, there is this sort of ethical aspect to Buddhism. And essentially, and especially we're going to talk about karma, and ethics will certainly play a big role in karma. But essentially, one way of viewing Buddhist ethics is if you're harming something, you're engaging in non-virtuous or negative behavior. And if you're helping or being positive with someone, then you're engaging in virtuous or positive behavior. So the big key idea, I think, is really to focus on the notion of harming. And in Buddhism, it's a very practical thing. Buddhism, you know, in Christianity and the Jewish tradition, we have the 10 Commandments. And the Buddhist actually has 10 virtuous behaviors and 10 non-virtuous behaviors. So there's sort of a similarity. But the difference is that in Buddhism, what the Buddha really said is he said, you can't follow these things like they're commandments. You can't rigidly follow them and just apply them indiscriminately. But you actually have to look and see whether you actually, in the moment, in the way your behavior actually are harming someone. And so sometimes there's things that you do that may ostensibly on the surface look like you're harming something, but you may be doing it for the purpose of actually helping somebody. And that's what matters. What matters in Buddhism is what your intention is, whether your intention is an intention of harming or an intention of benefiting people. And that's what essentially runs through Buddhist ethics. So Buddhism is very flexible. Buddhism always sort of looks at what's really happening as opposed to following rigid rules. Another big focus on Buddhism is mindfulness. And the original Buddhist Sutras, sometimes these things were called heedfulness, paying attention to what you're doing. And what's in particular important to do is to focus on your intention of what you're doing at each moment. So when you're doing the various things in life, sometimes the things you're doing, in fact, most of the time, the things that you're doing are neutral. So they're neither benefiting or helping somebody. I mean, maybe you're cleaning out your garage or, vacuuming or something. It's sort of a neutral. You're not either doing anything that's either harming or benefiting. But for the most part, the Buddha always had this focus on paying attention. What's actually going through your mind moment by moment? What are you thinking about? What are your goals? What are your intentions? And so that plays a huge role in Buddhism. And we'll see that as we sort of go along. And I think the other thing, and meditation in particular, is the main tool in Buddhism that we use to develop this mindfulness or this awareness of what's going on in our mind. There's a particular form called Vipassana or mindfulness meditation, which is there's many types of meditation, but there's a particular type of meditation where we actually focus on developing mindfulness. And that's hugely, in fact, that's one of the best way for making your life better moment by moment, because you do those meditations and then you carry that same mindfulness from those meditations into your life, or at least you try to do that. And that is very helpful, particularly for controlling these negative states of mind. As we'll talk about, a lot of these negative states of mind are just really bad habits. They're bad habits of mind, and they seem like we're just on remote control. Sometimes in the Buddhist schools, they say that we're not in control of our mind. What they mean by that is that these delusions or afflictions, these negative habits of mind just take over. For example, somebody says something slightly nasty to us, and then all of a sudden, we get totally angry and we want to start harming that person. Things like that happen, and they often happen almost like we're on autopilot. Like in the blink of an eye, suddenly you change from a calm mind to a totally outraged, terrible state of mind. But especially through mindfulness meditation, you can learn to slow down all of your thought processes, to actually see the mechanisms that are going on inside your mind that create these sort of uncontrolled, almost chain reactions. And you can actually learn to change them and reverse them. And through that, you can actually learn to control your mind, to actually be able to make a decision how you will react in certain situations. And you can look at your reactions and you can decide whether those reactions are beneficial to you or are harmful to you, put you in a bad state of mind or negative states of mind. So this whole thing of mindfulness and meditation sort of go together. Okay, let me ask, so I'll just stop here again. I'll take little periodic breaks just to see if there's any questions. Okay, yeah, on Zoom, there is this thing. Are we gonna say something, Alicia?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, you're good, okay. Okay, so now another aspect that I think is important about Buddhism is that it is non-authoritarian. At least it is in its original form. Sometimes with the cultural overlays, we get very high-level gurus, and it seems like everybody, well, you see, especially in Tibetan, you see a lot of prostrations and things. It looks like everybody's bowing down to these people. And sometimes these people are treated in almost a godlike manner. But that is actually a cultural overlay. That's not in the original Buddhism. And the Buddha in particular never asked anybody to bow down to him. But, you know, in Buddhism, what the Buddha really said is he said that actually each person is responsible for their own spiritual path. And he emphasized this over and over again. What the Buddha said, he said, you know, I'm sort of like a guide. I'm telling you the results of my experience. The Buddha said, I, at one time, was a person exactly like you are now, with all the delusions, afflictions, and so forth in my mind. But I followed a spiritual path, and through following that spiritual path, I discovered the way to stop my suffering and to be happy and to achieve full enlightenment. But this was not an accident. The reason why I have become enlightened is because of the path I followed. In Buddhism, another big theme is cause and effect. Everything in Buddhism is cause and effect. Nothing happens unless there's a cause that causes that effect. So if you're going to become enlightened, it's not going to happen because it's random. It's going to happen because you've created the causes to become enlightened. And so what the Buddha said, I found the path to enlightenment. And I can tell you this path that I followed. And if you follow the same path that I followed, what happened to me, full enlightenment, will exactly happen to you. In fact, if you create the causes to become enlightened, there's no way that you won't become enlightened, because whatever in the way the world is a world of cause and effect. And if you create the causes for something to happen, it will happen. So in that sense, what the Buddha was really saying is the Buddha saying, I'm going to tell you what happened to me. I'm going to share with you my experiences and what I've learned. And I'm going to tell you what's most important for following this path. And the Buddha taught for 45 years. And that's the way he always taught. He always had this emphasis on helping people in their spiritual path, helping them to move further along the way. And in Buddhism, as we will discover, in fact, the last 3 classes aren't particularly about this, there is a specific path to enlightenment. And we can talk specifically about each of the spiritual accomplishments that you need to accomplish step by step as you go deeper and deeper along this spiritual path. And so the spiritual path, and it's not as though there's some secret mumbo jumbo. There's not some secret handshake that makes you enlightenment. There are very specific ways that you train yourself to become enlightened. And essentially the main path to enlightenment is purifying your mind of all these negativities. And there are specific practices for which that help you identify these negativities and help you remove them and help you go deeper and deeper along the spiritual path. And so that's, so again, we will be talking in very specific detail about the spiritual path in the last 3 of the classes. This first class is mainly introductory. So, and I think that's important to understand, is that nothing in Buddhism happens randomly. And it's important to learn what works and what doesn't work. In fact, what the Buddha said, I didn't discover Dharma, with the things that he taught. He said, the Dharma that I'm teaching you is the way the world really is. And you yourself can see for yourself that the world really is exactly that way. And the way that you will be able to see that, I think especially the most deepest way you can see that is in meditation, actually. But even in your ordinary life, you can look at the teachings and you can try them out and you can see for yourself whether they work or not, whether they're in accord with the way that the world really works or not. As we go along talking about it, also, you can listen to how I'm talking about it and you can see whether it makes sense for you. And because Buddhism is really, because each of us is responsible for our spiritual path, it's absolutely critical that actually develop that each of us has to develop that kind of understanding and see that, yes, this path is working, it is the right path, it is beneficial, because that's what gives you the motivation, the willingness to focus and do all the hard work it takes to achieve enlightenment. Because enlightenment is about hard work. It's about following a specific path. And what it's mainly about is actually training your mind to think in a different way than you normally think. But it's possible to do that training. It's possible to learn what steps you need to do that training, how you need to change your way of thinking, and to make a new way of thinking, a new habit that replaces all of the old bad habits that actually caused you grief and suffering in your current life or your previous life. Okay. The other thing too that I would say, I mean, we will talk also about karma, but in some sense, karma is really intimately related to these delusions, afflictions, these negative habits of mind. And so I'm going to come back and talk about that more in detail, because most people's view of karma is not really quite correct. And it's important to really look at karma in a correct way. The other thing too that I might in this section sort of conclude with is that in some sense, what I found is that there is an accumulative effect of practicing karma. So, cumulative effect of practicing Buddhism. And that is precisely because of karma. Because in the West, what people focus on is bad or negative karma. People are always afraid, oh, I've done some terrible thing, and therefore I'm going to get a karmic response and some terrible thing is going to happen to me. So the main focus in the West on karma is sort of fear and anxiety. Oh my God, what did I do wrong? What's going to happen to me? How can I stop it? And so forth. And just to speak to that, of course, one thing is that in Buddhism, it's particularly in the Tibetan tradition, there are ways of purifying negative karma, preventing negative karma from ripening into bad effects. But more generally, what I have found the longer I study Buddhism is that actually positive karma is far more important for your spiritual practice and for following along and deepening the spiritual path. And the reason for that is the same cause and effect. I mean, if you are going to achieve something wonderful, and going deeper into the spiritual path is a wonderful thing. It is an amazingly wonderful accomplishment. I mean, it makes your life happier, it makes your mind happier. It's an amazingly wonderful thing. To accomplish that, you have to create the causes and effects to develop that spirituality. And one way of doing that, of course, is what the actions that you're doing in the moment, whether you're meditating or what positive steps you're taking in the here and now. And that is an important thing that, of course, influences you on your spiritual path. But there are also karmic influences from previous lives, previous periods of your current life. So all of us create positive karma. We do beneficial, good things for people. And all of us have done that throughout this lifetime and many lifetimes. And again, we'll come and talk. This many lifetimes is something, again, that is misunderstood also. So we will go deeper into that. But even if you don't think about that, even in your current life, you've done good things. All of us have done good things. And all of that actually helps us progress on the spiritual path. Because when that good karma ripens, one of the ways it can ripen is it can ripen into spiritual realizations. It's like sometimes, when we're studying Buddhism, it's all confusing. Suddenly it's like, bing, this little light goes off in our mind, and suddenly we get it. Well, that might be some good karma ripening. Sometimes this good karma goes under different terms. It's sometimes called merit. The Sanskrit term for it is punya. But it's very important to realize that there's good karma also, and that's very important. I actually once knew a Buddhist nun who used to very frequently travel to major Buddhist events around the world. And so she was flying a lot. And at one point in her life, she suddenly noticed that for no good reason, all of a sudden she started getting these upgrades to business and first class, even though she didn't have the, the frequent flyer programs and stuff to do this. She's just people, the stewardess or whatever would see her and like her and would just upgrade her. And this kept happening a lot. And after a while, she actually got upset by this. And what made her upset is she realized, oh, these upgrades, I didn't do anything to create these upgrades. They must be positive karma ripening for her. And as soon as she thought that, she said, oh no, this is not good. So why isn't it good? And again, this is an interesting way of sort of how Buddhists think differently. Her thought was, I'm wasting this good karma on upgrades to first class tickets. What difference does it matter, whether I'm in regular class or business or first class, that's not a big deal. What matters in my life is my spiritual path and my spiritual realizations. I want all of my good karma to go towards achieving deeper spiritual realizations. And so then she went off and she did various prayers and so forth, actually asking for this good karma not to ripen in this way. And she told me that afterwards that she stopped getting all of the upgrades to first class and business class or whatsoever. So it's an interesting point of view, and again, it shows you how sometimes the Buddhist way of thinking can be radically different. Because I think for all of us, we would be jumping up and down. Wow, you mean I got upgraded to first class? That's really exciting. We would be so happy. But for her, having a broader point of view and seeing that really what matters, what is more important is my spiritual path, this wasn't a good thing. I was wasting this good positive karma. So that's actually one huge reason for wanting to generate positive karma, is because that's how you will actually progress on the spiritual path. So anyway, I think it's worthwhile just throwing that in. It's an interesting anecdote, and I've always found it fascinating. And to me, it was always very helpful in sort of changing the way you look at the world. So let me stop here. Again, this is a little bit of a natural breaking point. Again, so this is the beginning. So this is the end of the beginning part of the introduction. Let me just ask whether there's any questions on anything that I've talked about. Okay. So again, the other thing that happens in Buddhism too is I think it's sort of important to talk about all of this stuff, and we have to talk about it many times because this way of looking at the world is so radically different. I think you have to sort of keep repeating it and talking about it in different ways until it begins to sort of sink in that, yes, we actually are looking at the world through a different sort of lens, if you like, as a Buddhist. So again, I'm going to try to keep introducing these little anecdotes and things because I think they can be helpful in sort of getting the idea of how we're trying to change how we look upon the world. So now what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the life story of Buddha. Again, we're not going to, actually, there's not a huge amount to say about the life story of Buddha, but we're going to talk about the key things that, in respect to which, how they influenced the teachings that he gave and how things evolved from there. And then after that, we're going to talk about the history of Buddhism, because I think that the two go together. First, who was the Buddha? What happened in his life? And then how did Buddhism evolve after that until we've reached where we are in the present stage? Because I think having that overview of, how historically Buddhism evolved, I think sort of helps and give you a bigger picture. And then once we have that, then we're going to shift gears and start focusing on the core, the most important aspects of Buddhist teachings. So at this point, this is a 2-hour class, and people often get a little antsy. And so traditionally, we always have a little break. So I'm going to set a timer. I think 7 minutes is about the right amount of time. So I'm just going to stop for 7 minutes. And then after that, I'll come back and then we'll finish the rest of this class, the second hour of this class. So is that okay with everybody? Okay. So I'm going to actually set a timer for 7 minutes. And I'm going to turn off my video and mute. And so I will come back and call for you back in 7 minutes. Okay, so our 7 minutes are up. So hopefully you are back. I try not to have too long a break because we've got a lot of material to go through. But on the other hand, I want to have enough time so that people can at least take care of their needs a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to launch into the second half. So we're going to start with the life story of Buddha. So who was Buddha and when did he live? So I think it's helpful, in my mind, I set Buddha around 500 BC. And that's just a round number. It turns out that historically, in ancient India, they never really cared much about history. So they weren't very good at recording events and this is true not only of Buddhism, but also even the rest of the history of India. And I know a lot of, I've read books where historians of ancient India sort of bemoan this fact and say, how are we going to know anything about what happened other than archaeology or whatever? And so the same thing is true of also Buddha. So we think that he lived roughly around, I think 500 BC is just a good round number. Some people set him a little bit earlier, and some people say he lived from 566 to 486 BC. Some people set it later than that, 448 to 368. But if you average between those two, it's roughly 500 BC. So I think that's just a good round number. So he lived roughly around 500 BC. He himself was born into a very high level family. So they talk about his father as being a king, and it was, the name actually was King Shuddhodana, and his mother was called Queen Maya. Although some people actually believe that, so the India of that time had thousands of little small kingdoms. And this was almost like similar to the medieval structure of medieval Europe, where you had these small kingdoms, and then many of these small kingdoms would become vassals of larger kingdoms or under the control of larger kingdoms who would have some sort of local autonomy. And we actually believe that that was true of where Buddha lived. So he belonged to the, he's called Buddha Shakyamuni because Shakya is the name of the clan to which he belonged to. So he was, the people of his country were called Shakyans. And it's believed that they were actually a vassal of a larger nearby place called Kosala. And some people, and in fact, besides kingdoms, there were also even republics around at this time in India, also small republics. And it's a little bit unclear whether Buddha's father was an elected head of the government or whether he was, was passed down from father to son or whatever. So it's a little bit confusing exactly what it was. But anyway, basically, Buddha was the son of the ruler. And he was extremely wealthy. And so he grew up in this great wealth. And just before he grew up, though, before he was born, when his mother was pregnant, there were all these auspicious dreams and so forth about that he was going to be somebody great, some kind of great person. And so his parents went and to some various fortune tellers or soothsayers or wise men, and they asked what were the meanings of all of these dreams and so forth. And essentially what these wise men said was oh, to you is going to be born a son, and this son can turn out, is going to be a great man one way or another. But there's two directions that he can turn. One way that he can turn is that he can become a great king, and he can actually take over and rule maybe like all of India or something like that. He can sort of, they would call him a Chakravartin king. So he could become this great ruler king of this vast, maybe even of all of India when he grows up. And that, of course, got his father quite excited. The second possibility is that he could become a great religious leader. And for his father, that was not such a great outcome. And so that colored the way that he was brought up, according to the stories we have. So his father did everything he could to sort of move him away from religion and into the secular life. So he was brought up like a prince. He was taught, had this wonderful education. He was taught how to, ride a horse, how to use weapons, how to do all the things that a prince would do. And in particular, he grew up in this very lavish lifestyle. In India, they had 3 different seasons of the year, a rainy season and 2 other seasons, maybe a hot and cold season. And for each season, he had a separate palace where he would live. And these palaces, especially the rainy season where you get stuck during all the heavy rains, were populated mainly by women, almost entirely by beautiful women, because his father was, again, trying to entice him away from any sort of religion. And so the Buddha grew up in great luxury, and he actually ended up getting married. He got married to this other woman who was, again, like a princess of a neighboring country by the name of Yasodhara. And more than that, they actually had one child called Rahula. And about the time that his son Rahula was being born, the Buddha started to get very curious about the world in which he lived, because his father had done everything he could to isolate him from the ordinary people and sort of, cushion him in this very luxurious lifestyle, hoping he would grow up to become this great king and fulfill the prophecy. So at that time, according to the mythology, there were 3 messengers that came to Buddha. So of course, these are messengers in sort of like an analog, symbolic sort of messengers, if you like. So the first messenger was the messenger of a sick person. So at one point, the Buddha made an escape with one of his companions, wandered around the city, and came upon a sick person. And he was astonished to see how the sickness had ravaged this person. And he said, that's terrible, and actually, when he thought about it some more, he said that any of us could actually become sick and go through the suffering of sickness. And he thought that was just absolutely terrible. So another time he broke out, and you had the second messenger of so-called symbolic form, as he was wandering around the city, and he saw a very old person. And then it occurred to him, oh, everybody gets old. And it's a great suffering to get old. Your body falls apart, you have many bodily pains and so forth, and you don't have the facility you had when you were young. And he thought, that's another suffering of life. That's absolutely terrible. And then finally, the third messenger was, again, he broke out again, and he actually met somebody who had died and was having a funeral. And he realized, oh, actually everyone will die. And that is also a great suffering. And according to the mythology of the time, there was actually sort of a, if you like, sort of almost a fourth messenger that he ran across after that, which he met an ascetic. At that time in India, there were religious people who wandered through the forests of India and would live by begging for food. And the people of that period thought it was actually a very spiritual thing to actually feed these people and take care of them, give them food and medicine, and that it would create very good karma, because in the India of that time, they also had their own view of karma. And actually that tradition still exists in India today. There are still religious people who wander around the countryside of India that have they're homeless people basically, but they have different religious points of view. And these religious wanderers have all sorts of religious views, from very secular views to, sort of hermit-like views and so forth. Some of them go without clothes, some of them wear rags for clothes. They can be extremely wild. I saw a recent documentary on India where one person was holding his hand up, thinking that would create good karma for him. So he never put his arm down, he just would hold it. And he would even sleep like that somehow, I don't know. So anyways, so at that time, there were also large numbers of ascetics. And so that gave the Buddha the idea, I could become a religious person also. And as the story went, the Buddha became so vexed by the notion that there is suffering in the world and that nobody knew how to stop that suffering, that he decided that there had to be some way and that he was going to personally find it. So he made the decision to leave his sort of cozy life and to head off and become an ascetic. So according to the story, he snuck away and went off and became one of these wandering ascetics. And this happened when he was around 29 years old. And I think it was just after his first son had been born, but he considered that this mission was more important than family life. And of course, he was in a very wealthy family, so he didn't have to worry about his wife or kid. They would be well taken care of. So anyway, he leaves and he becomes this religious wanderer. And as later on, we'll find out that he actually, later on, both his wife and his son became religious followers of the Buddha, and they themselves achieved enlightenment. So they didn't turn out so bad for them in the end, at least according to what is said about this period. So anyway, so at the age of 29, the Buddha shaves off his beard, takes up the standard sort of clothes that these sort of wandering religious people would wear, sort of similar to the way that the religious Buddhists dress today. And he starts wandering, and he goes and he thinks, I need a spiritual teacher. So he goes to a spiritual teacher. I forgot to write down. They have specific names. But anyway, so he goes to a first teacher who teaches him very deep levels of meditation. And the Buddha is very happy learning this, and he's very good at it. And eventually what the Buddha decides, he says, he looks at the leader of this community. And he says, I bet I could accomplish the same levels of meditation that my teacher has accomplished if I really am determined enough. And so he sat down and really focused on learning meditation. And he achieved the same level as his teacher. At that point, his teacher offered to make him a co-leader of their religious community, but the Buddha refused. And in fact, at that point, the Buddha left him because the Buddha said, I've learned everything I can learn from this person, but he doesn't know how to stop suffering. So I have not accomplished my mission, and I'm not going to stop until I accomplish this mission. And I know there has to be some way to stop human suffering. So at that point, he wandered and he found another religious leader who actually went into deeper levels of meditation. And once again, the Buddha decided that he could do the same thing, and he did. He accomplished the same, now much, much deeper level of meditation. And when he accomplished that, at that point, his teacher was just amazed and actually offered to make him the leader of the spiritual community. But once again, the Buddha refused because he could do these wonderful deep meditations, which were very blissful and so forth. But he realized that at some point he could get sick, he was going to grow old, and he was going to die. So it hadn't solved his problem. So at that point, the Buddha actually went for a period of wandering. So he actually found a group, I think there were a group of 5 other people like him, and they decided that the way to make spiritual progress was to practice deep asceticism. So this thing where you hardly eat anything at all, you meditate day and night. And so the Buddha started following this very arduous asceticism, thinking, oh, if I can be as ascetic as possible, then that surely must lead to the correct answer of how to end human suffering. So he did this for quite a long period of time. And in fact, he was wandering again throughout all of these various teachers, roughly from the age of 29 to the age of 35. And around the age of 35, the Buddha was actually getting extremely sick. His hair was falling out, he was sort of, I don't know if this is literally true, but he was eating 1 grain of rice once a week, his body was emaciating, dying of hunger, basically. So he was his whole body was basically falling apart from this deep asceticism. And as according to the story went, at that point, a thought came into his mind while he was meditating, and he remembered a period when he was a young boy, and he was sitting under a tree in the shade while his father, the king, was doing some religious ceremony for the agricultural workers in a field. And when he was doing that, he realized he had this very blissful meditation. And when he remembered that meditation, it suddenly hit him that the asceticism wasn't doing him any good, and that this meditation that he had as a young boy was actually far better. And at that point, he realized that the asceticism was not the right path, and he gave it up. And so that's when he started what's known as the middle way. And that's another theme that goes all throughout Buddhism that we will come back and talk again and again about, the middle way. Because everything in Buddhism is moderate. It's neither one extreme nor the other extreme. And that just comes up in all sorts of different contexts. And in particular, it comes up in this context of the spiritual path. So in the Buddhist spiritual path, you're not supposed to practice extreme asceticism. You're not, on the other hand, you're also not supposed to practice the opposite, which would be, like an extremely luxurious lifestyle. So you're neither at one extreme, focused on, just consumer goods and being comfortable with having tons of money. That's one extreme, which isn't helpful. The other extreme, which isn't helpful, is this extreme asceticism. Because again, as I talked about, we have to ultimately look at cause and effect. And just abusing your body is not a cause of enlightenment. To achieve enlightenment, you have to create the proper spiritual causes. And just abusing your body is not a cause of that. So after that, the Buddha got some help from people around him, and he nursed himself back. He was nursed back to health. And at that point, as the story goes, he decided that he was just going to sit down under the Bodhi tree and meditate until he achieved full enlightenment. And that is basically what happened. He sat under the Bodhi tree. He had all of these deep spiritual realizations. He could remember all of his former lives. He could see what was happening to all the other sentient beings, human beings around him, how they were being reborn. He had all of these supernatural spiritual powers, and he achieved full enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. There's also other stories about how he's tempted by Mara and so forth. So there's lots of things going on. But anyway, it's not important. So at that point, he became the Buddha. He became fully enlightened. And as we later learned, he would often talk about his previous lifetimes, which he knew he had actually been on a spiritual path for countless thousands, millions of lifetimes before. And so this achieving of Buddhahood was not just an accidental thing of this one lifetime, but he had actually been preparing for it in many previous lives before that. So at that point, the Buddha became the Buddha. And he essentially at that point gave teachings for the next 35 years. So at the age of, next 45 years. So he became the Buddha around the age of 35 after these 6 years of religious wandering. And then he taught and died around the age of 80 when he achieved what's called parinirvana, which is essentially he died. And then as we will come to talk about it, once you achieve enlightenment, you're never reborn in samsara, which is this sort of life that we live. And I'm going to come and explain more about Samsara and Nirvana, the states that he achieved. Just before he died, he actually, when he was giving teachings, he actually helped and gave teachings, and many of his other disciples also achieved enlightenment. They didn't achieve the same full enlightenment he had, but they were liberated from samsara and achieved nirvana, which again, I'm going to explain more. And I'm going to explain more about the level that the Buddha was at and the level that his followers attained. The other thing he did, which was quite interesting, is just before he died, he gave a teachings where he talked about becoming an island or lamp unto yourself, because the students were saying, what are we going to do? And the Buddha said, essentially, I've told you everything you need to know. I've given you all of the Dharma teachings, all of the religious teachings. I've laid out the whole path for you. And now you just simply have to practice it. But it was quite interesting that he talked about becoming an island or a lamp unto yourself. And it's interesting because the reason why there's these two meanings is that he used the Sanskrit word, I think it's Dvipa, which actually has both of these meanings. And the Buddha was extremely good with words during his lifetime of teachings. And he would often use words that have multiple meanings and would often mean both. And so I think that he meant both in this case. He was saying, each person has the responsibility for their own spiritual life. The other thing that was quite interesting that happened at this time, just before he died, is, he told everybody he was going to die and when he was going to die and so forth. And all of his disciples, or many of them, sort of went berserk saying, oh my God, what's going to happen to us? You're our spiritual teacher. Who's going to take care of us? Who's going to lead us along the spiritual path? And that's when he gave this teaching about being an island or lamp unto yourself. But the other thing that his disciples said, they said, well, if you're going to die, you need to take one of the, the most spiritual of us and appoint them to lead us. So at least we will have some person who can actually lead us, and you should tell us who that person is. And at that point, the Buddha absolutely refused to do that. So it's sort of the opposite of Christianity. In Christianity, you have the stories that Christ appointed Peter to be his leader after he died. And so in the Catholic Church, you have all of the mythology or stories about Peter being the rock, Peter meaning rock in a translation of his name, but Peter being the rock upon which Christ would build his church. And so that's the origin of Catholicism and the origin of the Pope system in Catholicism, that you always had the Pope who was the leader of Catholicism. But in Buddha's case, he refused to do that. And so that's part of the reason why when you look at Buddhism around the world, it's also disorganized. There is no Pope of Buddhism, and there never will be a Pope of Buddhism. There's nobody who runs Buddhism. It's essentially the Buddha gave his teachings, and various disciples in turn taught those teachings, and they spread around the world. And as they spread around the world, each of them acquired these various cultural aspects of wherever they were teaching. And so that's why Buddhism has so many different forms, and why to the outside eye it looks so completely disorganized. So I think that's actually a very fascinating point, which I'm not sure many people know about. So this is sort of just a quick snapshot of Buddha's life. But again, it's sort of done within this context of motivating why Buddhism will develop the way it does and what the main concerns are. This focus on relieving suffering, which will be a huge part of the Four Noble Truths, which are the Buddha's core teaching, which I'm going to come to. Not quite yet. The next thing is the history of Buddhism. But let me stop and just, again, check and see if there's any questions. Does anybody have any questions? This was very hurried and brief and just a few key points. Okay. Okay, so if there's no questions, then I'm going to launch into the next phase, which is what happened to Buddhism. So we saw there's no Pope of Buddhism. So what was going to happen to Buddhism? What happened to Buddhism is essentially there were what they call schisms, which means that Buddha very quickly broke into 18 different schools. A lot of these breaks weren't like they were in Christianity. You know, in Christianity, you had the Protestants and the Catholics and many different types of Protestants. And each different type of Protestant religion actually believed different things. And they all thought that everybody else believed the wrong thing. And, you know, they actually were burned people at the stake, did all sorts of terrible things if you didn't believe exactly what your neighbors thought. So in Christianity, it was all about belief. In early Buddhism, a lot of the division of these different communities was really about the Vinaya rules. And I'll explain about the Vinaya more later on. But essentially, at the time of Buddha, the monks kept getting into trouble, even while Buddha was alive. They would get in fights with each other, and there were problems, and they would come to the Buddha, and the Buddha would sort of resolve the situation. And each time he did that, he made a rule. And they recorded this, and this became one of the there's three sets of Buddhist teachings. One called the Sutras, the other called the Vinaya, and the other called the Abhidharma. The sutras are actually sort of the historical recording of all the different things that Buddha said and did while he was giving all of his spiritual teachings. So he would go to a certain place, teach those people a certain spiritual teachings, and the monks would remember those and record it. And several hundred years after Buddha died, all of these things got written down of all of the different teachings he gave during his lifetime. And that's what the sutras are. So they're sort of the history of what all the things that the Buddha did, where he went and what he taught. The Vinaya were all these rules made for the monks. And what's interesting about the Vinaya is they recorded not only what the rule was, but they also recorded the original circumstances where the rule was created. So if you were a monk and there was a certain rule you followed, you could go to the Vinaya and you could find out why Buddha made that rule, but who the monks were that were fighting or whatever. And so you sort of got an understanding of the rule besides just given the rule itself. So that's what the Vinaya is. And the monks you know, it almost always seems the case in all religious and even secular society. There's always hardcore people who want to be more strict. And there's always some people who are more relaxed and just say, well, let's just sort of follow in the spirit of things. And so with these early monks, you had these sorts of things. So there were always some monks who wanted to be more strict about all the rules. And so they would often sort of go off and form their own congregations. And the other monks who were uncomfortable with that would go off and form their congregations. So most of the early splits had little to do with actually believing different parts of teachings being true or false. The other thing that happened too was geographical, because some of these monks that followed Buddha had come from more distant parts of India. And so after the Buddha died, they returned to wherever they went. And with the geographical separations of such, 500 BC, they would become sort of distant from each other. It was hard to communicate. So they naturally tended to form their own little local communities. And then they would have, their own spiritual leaders, and they would sort of evolve slightly differently. So that's mainly how these 18 schools originally grew up. There were various councils. immediately after the Buddha died, all the monks got together and they recited all the sutra part, all of the various stories about Buddha. And they had specific monks who were set up to remember. They would collect these things in different collections of stories, often called Nikayas today. And then they would have specific monks whose job was to memorize these things and keep track of it. And the people in those days had remarkable memories. And they were used to this. The Indian Vedas were also completely memorized originally. So there were, at that period of time, writing was not so common. And so most things that were religious were oral, and people had amazing memories back then. And so that's how the collection of the original Buddha Sutras. Sutras means a thread, and it means that they were sort of like individual little stories, if you like. And all of these things were collected, although some of them can be quite lengthy. There are some things which are quite long stories. But anyway, that's how we have the recording of what Buddha originally taught. And these were passed down from generation to generation. And then I think it's roughly around 300 years later, after the Buddha died, they eventually got written down in various forms. And then the Abhidharma was Buddhist philosophy. Excuse me. And the way that the Buddhist philosophy got started was that even when Buddha was alive, he had large numbers of followers, and he couldn't teach everybody individually. So oftentimes the younger or the newer recruits would be taught by the older, more experienced monks. And so those monks had to develop ways of teaching what the Buddha had taught. And originally there was what they called maturkas, which were sort of lists of teachings. You know, the Buddha often taught in sort of a numerical format because he knew that everybody memorized the teaching. So the Buddha would go and say, well, there's 5 ways that you need to do to accomplish this. And so he would give those 5 things. And then the monks would go off and memorize that. And you had these various lists floating around of the various spiritual teachings. And then eventually they collected them and they made them more coherent, so they are easier to teach to the younger Buddhist monks. And out of that is what eventually became Buddhist philosophy. And it became, as they tried to make the teachings more coherent and put them all together in a very coherent way, eventually that's what became Buddhist philosophy and evolved for, thousands of years after that, which is why it became so deep and so complicated by the time it reaches the modern day. So that's what's called the Abhidharma. Okay, so so at this point, so what happens? So originally, Buddhism was in India, and Buddhism lasted in India from the time of Buddha, roughly 500 BC, and then surprisingly, Buddhism died out in India around 1100 to 1200 AD. And there's reasons for that. And it was in some sense wiped out, possibly. But anyway, but that's still, over 1,000 years that Buddhism was in India. And originally Buddhism was only in India. And Buddhism evolved. It was supported by many kings and rulers. And when the local rulers and kings and so forth supported Buddhism, it flourished. When they were against Buddhism and maybe supported more of the Hindu religion, then Buddhists could actually even be persecuted or thrown out. And so the fortunes of Buddhism went up and down. And it was mainly centered, the key area, Buddha actually, when he lived in sort of northern India, slightly northeastern India, actually near the border of Nepal. In fact, some of the events in Buddha's life, they fight over between India and Nepal, whether they were in Nepal or in India, because you can make a lot of money off tourists these days. But it was part of where the Buddha taught was in sort of Nepal, and part of it was sort of northern India next to Nepal. And from there, of course, it spread out. But sort of the main Buddhist centers were mainly in northern India, although it did spread all the way to the south. And the fortunes went up and down, and there's a famous around 3rd century BC, Ashoka was a very famous, powerful king, and he strongly supported Buddhism. So Buddhism especially became very powerful then. And in fact, under Ashoka's rule, Buddhism spread very importantly down to the southern, off of the southern tip of India is this island, which is now known as Sri Lanka. And Buddhism spread there, and that became very important. And that's the origin of Theravadan Buddhism. And the fortunes in Sri Lanka actually also went up and down, depending on who the rulers were, and they had various monasteries. But essentially, it was continuous from the 3rd century BC to the present age. And the importance of the Theravadan school is that they have a complete set of scriptures. They've got a complete set of the Buddhist Sutras and the complete Vinaya setting of the Vinaya. So they have a complete set of the early Abhidharma teachings that were common, probably dating back to this 3rd century BC. So it's this huge repository of Buddhist knowledge. And in fact, if you want to read the Buddhist Sutras today, the people who publish all of these things are the Theravadins. And they were written in a language called Pali, which is like a dialect that was in, they think it might have been around where Buddha was teaching. They don't know if the Buddha actually spoke Pali or not, but it was probably at least what Buddha spoke, or similar to another dialect similar to what Buddha spoke when he was wandering around this northern part of India. So that's what it's basically a simplified Sanskrit. So it's very similar to Sanskrit. If you know Sanskrit, it's very easy to learn Pali. So anyway, that's what these scriptures, these sutras are written in. And the Theravadins published wonderful translations with wonderful commentaries with additional stories that explain everything. So I spend a lot of time actually reading these sutras. They're actually wonderful things. So that's one place. And so Buddhism, and from there it spread, that from the Theravada it spread to the neighboring lands like Thailand and Cambodia and all sort of the areas around that part of Asia. So that's one place. And that was the earliest place where Buddhism spread. So other than Sri Lanka and those sort of areas, mainly Buddhism sort of stayed in India. And in India, especially when times were good, enormous Buddhist monasteries were built of great scholarship and learning, developed very complex Buddhist philosophy. Nalanda is one of the most famous of these universities. And so Buddhism was really flourishing very strong, and it was supported by many rulers in that northern part of India. Okay, so then later on, there was a change in Buddhism. And this change is a new form of Buddhism developed called the Mahayana form of Buddhism. And the Mahayana, in my mind, is sort of the, if you like, the logical continuation of the earlier form of Buddhism, but it has much more emphasis on compassion and helping others. And there's a notion of bodhicitta, which is the core notion of the Mahayana, which I'm probably going to spend the whole class talking about because it's absolutely critical. And in the modern world, they sort of make a divide of Buddhism into two parts. One is called the Mahayana, which everybody agrees on. But the Mahayana is always called the earlier form of Buddhism, Hinayana. So Maha in Sanskrit means great, and Hinayana means vehicle. So the Mahayanas were saying, oh, we're the great vehicle. And these earlier forms are the inferior or lesser vehicle, the Hinayana. So it was sort of a denigration of the earlier form of Buddhism. And we'll talk a little bit more why they thought this way. In modern times, people have gotten away from that. And the Theravadins are the only active group today who belong to this Hinayana class. And they call themselves Theravadins, which was not their original name, but it developed several hundred years ago. And they've settled on that because they always felt denigrated by this slur of the Mahayanas calling them the lesser vehicle. And actually, the Dalai Lama and many more modern Buddhists are much more careful about that. And they call the Hinayana path things like the fundamental vehicle. Because in fact, the Mahayana path is built on top of the original Buddhism. And you can't practice the Mahayana path without practicing the Hinayana path. So calling it the fundamental vehicle actually makes a lot of sense. The Hinayana path is the core Buddhist path. And the Mahayana path, if you like, just adds to the Hinayana path and emphasizes certain things. But I would say that everything in the Mahayana is sort of at least implicitly in the Hinayana path, which is what the Theravadins also say. But anyway, this Mahayana tradition developed around the 1st century BC, so about 400 years after the Buddha taught. And it spread like wildfire. And at the time, again, as I said before, Buddhists aren't that much into beliefs. So the Mahayana and the Hinayana people lived quite happily in the same monasteries. And we know this is true because later on there were pilgrims or tourists, if you like, from China who visited these monasteries and told us that this is what happened. So in the early days of the Mahayana, in fact, all throughout the period of the Mahayana, it was very easy to mingle between these two. What really mattered as a monk is what rules you followed in your monastery, and that was the Vinaya. So whether you believed in the Mahayana path or the Hinayana path really didn't matter. What mattered is that you followed the same monkish rules as all of your co-monks. So anyway, the Mahayana rose around the 1st century BC. And interestingly enough, it's the Mahayana which then spread to all the other countries. So in the modern world today, almost all of Buddhism is Mahayana lineage. And there are speculations about that. There was a guy named Edward Kahns, a Buddhist scholar who's dead now. But anyway, his speculation was he thought that the Mahayana path was more flexible and adapting to local cultural traditions. So it fits, so wherever Buddhism spread, it would fit into the local culture more easily. And that's the reason why the Mahayana spread was the dominant form of Buddhism that spread. But I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's an interesting speculation. But anyway, so the spreading began around actually we had the early spread in the 3rd century BC down to Sri Lanka and those parts. So it spread in other directions around the 1st century BC also. Around the 1st century BC, around 200 years later, it started spreading to China, which was the natural place for it to spread. And there were actually different waves of Buddhism spreading to China. And in fact, the Buddhism that spread to China was, especially from today's perspective, extremely important because all of the original Sanskrit and Pali and all the other Buddhist scriptures and philosophy was translated into Chinese. And as I'm going to explain, Buddhism got killed out in India, and a lot of these early manuscripts disappeared. The original Sanskrits of many of the original scriptures were destroyed. And so it was actually in China, which is where we have a repository. So the stuff that got translated into Chinese is in many cases our only version of some of these early texts by many important and famous Buddhist philosophers. So anyway, Buddhism spread to China, and from there it kept spreading further and further. So eventually it spread to Korea. So it started spreading to China very early on, around the 1st century BC, but there were later spreads later on. And then from there it went to Korea, which is the next logical place as you're sort of heading off in that direction. And God, I thought I'd written it down. So I think it's, it's more like, that's funny. I thought I had, in my notes, I had written that down when it hit, okay, I guess I missed that. So anyway, it did spread, oh, hang on, maybe I had it here, to, when did it spread to Korea? Anyway. Okay, well, many hundreds of years later, it started. Yeah, so there was a second wave into China around 500 AD. And then Korea came in around the 7th century AD. And then from there, it eventually spread to Japan around the 12th century AD. And so you can see it just kept spreading further and further. And in China, there were at least 10 different schools of Buddhism, because it spread with different teachers who moved from India to China. And of course, China is a big country. So you got various variants that were spreading, but all of it Mahayana. And again, the same thing, all the Zen and all the other stuff in Korea and Japan were Mahayana schools. Zen is a Mahayana school. And of course, in all these different countries, there were also various great teachers who developed sort of variations. So there's at least 3 major Zen schools in Japan, for example, and probably more. So the mixing is very complicated, and I think not important for our purposes, but you can see how it sort of spread in that direction. It also spread to Mongolia, interestingly enough, and there were some very deep forms of Buddhism in Mongolia, and some of those teachers even eventually came to the United States and were important in US Buddhism. And of course, for our purposes, from our center, the important thing was Tibet. And so it came to Tibet around 770 AD with Padmanabhasava, who was this great Indian teacher. I think he was invited to Tibet. And so he started Tibetan Buddhism. So we can call it roughly 800 AD to round it off. And that started Buddhism. Buddhism flourished for several hundred years, then it eventually declined, and it had a hostile king who didn't like it, who nearly wiped it out. And then after that, after he was gone, they requested more teachers from India to teach Buddhism. And there was a second wave of Buddhism that started with Atisha, which was around 1000 AD, I think. And from that time of Atisha on to the present time, of course, Buddhism became the dominant religion in Tibet, sort of wiping out an earlier religion, which was called Bon religion. And over time, 4 different lineages of Tibetan Buddhism were established. So the original was called the Nyingma, and that still exists today. So we actually have a Nyingma center, I don't know, a few blocks from where I live, actually. Another lineage was started by Milarepa and Marpa and Milarepa, who were great meditators. So it's a lineage very heavily focused on meditators. Some of these people would go off to caves and spend months, days, and nights, never stop meditating in caves. And that's called the Kagyu. And again, we have a stupa in Santa Fe that's run by the Kagyu people. And then around the same thing, so this is around 1000 AD, there was a very scholarly group called the Sakyas that started. And these Sakyas were particularly important for translating a lot of the Sanskrit texts into Tibetan. And so they did an amazing job they were a very intellectual order. And then around 1400, the Gelugpa, which is the dominant form of Tibetan Buddhism today, was started by Lama Tsongkhapa. He lived from 1357 to 1419. And they are also very scholarly. In fact, Tsongkhapa was originally a Sakya, but eventually he was such an amazing teacher that a whole tradition grew up around him, and that's the Gelugpa. And that's what the Dalai Lama formally belongs to. The Dalai Lama is always formally a Gelugpa. And by far over time, that eventually became by far in terms of numbers and influence, was the most prominent form. You can see that because the Dalai Lama was the leader, eventually became the leader of Tibet. And again, the other important thing is that because of all this translation, the Tibetans are the third place where we have a complete set of Buddhist texts. So we have the Buddhist sects from the Sri Lankans, the Pali form. We have the Buddhist texts that were translated into Chinese. And then we have the Buddhist texts that were translated into Tibetan. And as I said before, Buddhism died out around 1100, 1200 AD. It came at the same time as the Muslims were sweeping into India from the north. And these Muslims actually killed all the monks and destroyed all of the texts and learning in those monasteries in the north of India. Although there are suspicions that the Hindus also were happy to see the Buddhists go, and that they were also persecuting the Buddhists, mainly because Buddhism did not believe in the caste system, which is a sort of internal racist system in India. But anyway, the Buddha said that caste system was completely nonsense, and Buddhism has always said that the caste system is totally nonsense. How you're born is not who you are. Whether you're a good or bad person is what's important in Buddhism. So, but anyway, Buddhism was virtually wiped out. And so today there's a small remnant of Buddhism in India, but the Buddhism that we have today is because it spread to all of these other countries, which I think is quite interesting. So anyway, that's sort of in a nutshell the Buddhist history. I've run over my time slightly, which I try not to do. It's 9:04 according to my little watch. So I will stop here. And next time we will actually start focusing on the Four Noble Truths, which are the core of it. And I think if you understand the Four Noble Truths, you've really got the main part of Buddhism in a nutshell, so to speak. So perfect for this course. And then from there, I will follow along with so it'll be the next major topic is the Four Noble Truths. And then after that, we will follow the rest of the path all the way to enlightenment, all of the different phases from beginning to end in the third and fourth classes. So let me just stop here and ask if there's any questions. So, okay. I hope what I've been saying is clear. A lot of it's been sort of history and sort of just a big picture. And so as we get into more detail, I think many of these ideas will become clearer and easier to understand, I hope. But I think it's also, so even this whole course is a 4-part course, which is an introductory Buddhism. I think it's very helpful to start by just sort of getting an idea, a beginning inkling of how Buddhists think and how different that is, so that then as we get more into the deeper teachings, you can sort of follow those same themes all the way through. And hopefully the picture you will have at the end of the course will be sort of a coherent idea about how all of the Buddhist ideas coherently fit together. And in fact, that's one of the things that I find most remarkable about Buddhism, is that every single different aspect of Buddhism sort of reinforces and supports all the other aspects. And so actually all of the different teachings. And that's why when you become a Mahayanist, you can't forget the earlier fundamental or Hinayana teachings, because you need those. You can never drop any of the teachings. They all support and help each other. And I think it's very helpful to see how these things tie together. And to a large part, that's what I hope to accomplish in this course. And so hopefully, I mean, I'm going very quickly through a vast amount of material. Buddhism has existed for 2,500 years, and the literature is enormously vast, but still I'm trying to sort of pick out the main themes so that you can sort of hopefully see a coherence and see a big picture that sort of makes sense, is what I'm hoping for. I will let you know if I'm successful. Okay, so I will stop here. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, hopefully I will see you next week.